History is often written by the victors, but buried beneath grand empires and riches lies a much darker truth. These are the top 10 most disturbing and tragic moments in colonial history, stories of cruelty, greed, and genocide that shaped the modern world. One of the most horrifying examples of colonial exploitation occurred in the Congo Free State, which was privately controlled by Belgium's King Leopold II. Under the guise of humanitarian and civilizing missions, Leopold's regime forced millions of Congolese people into brutal labor to harvest rubber. Villages were terrorized by the Force Publique, a private army that used mutilation, hostage-taking, and murder to enforce quotas. Those who resisted were often executed, and it was common for soldiers to cut off the hands of the dead, or the living, to prove bullets hadn't been wasted. The human cost of Leopold's rule is staggering. Estimates suggest that between 10 to 15 million people died during this period, either from direct violence or from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. International outrage eventually forced Belgium to take control of the colony from Leopold. But the damage had been done. The Congo Free State remains one of the most brutal chapters in the history of colonial exploitation. Under British colonial rule, Bengal suffered several famines, but the one in 1943 was particularly devastating. While World War II raged on, British authorities diverted food and resources to support the war effort, ignoring the growing crisis in India. A combination of poor harvests, hoarding, wartime inflation, and disastrous colonial policies led to a catastrophic famine that killed an estimated 3 million people. Winston Churchill's government is often criticized for its response to the famine. Despite pleas from Indian leaders, the British refused to redirect food shipments or provide adequate relief. Churchill himself blamed Indians for breeding like rabbits and diverted food to British soldiers and other white colonies instead. The famine exposed the deep racial and economic injustices of the British Empire and remains a powerful symbol of colonial negligence and cruelty. In what many historians consider the first genocide of the 20th century, German colonial forces systematically exterminated the Herero and Nama peoples in present-day Namibia. After a rebellion against German rule, General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order in 1904, declaring that every Herero found within German territory was to be killed, regardless of age or gender. Tens of thousands were driven into the desert, where German forces poisoned water holes and blocked access to food and shelter. Survivors were sent to concentration camps, subjected to forced labor, medical experiments, and rampant abuse. By the end of the campaign, around 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations had perished. This genocide laid the groundwork for later atrocities and demonstrated how imperial ideologies dehumanized entire populations. This was really the first genocide of the 20th century. Spanning over 400 years, the Atlantic slave trade saw the forced transport of an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans across the ocean, primarily to the Americas. European colonial powers such as Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, and the Netherlands profited immensely from this brutal system. Africans were kidnapped, chained, and packed into ships in horrific conditions, with many dying en route from disease, starvation, and abuse. Slaves were sold and forced to work on plantations, often under inhuman conditions with no legal rights and constant threats of violence. Families were torn apart, cultures were destroyed, and entire societies were destabilized. The legacy of the slave trade continues to shape racial and economic inequalities today, and it stands as a central example of the brutality of colonialism. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the Americas initiated a wave of conquest, enslavement, and disease that devastated indigenous populations. The most infamous example is the fall of the Aztec Empire to Hernán Cortés and his men. Armed with superior weapons and aided by local rival tribes, the Spanish overthrew mighty civilizations in just a few years. But the violence didn't stop there. Millions of indigenous people died, not only through warfare and forced labor in the encomienda system, but also due to the spread of smallpox and other European diseases. Entire cultures were erased, sacred texts burned, and survivors were often converted by force to Christianity. The conquest of the Americas marks one of the most significant and violent cultural destructions in human history. The Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya was a grassroots movement by the Kikuyu people to resist British colonial rule and reclaim stolen land. The British government responded with a campaign of mass arrests, detention camps, and torture. Thousands were detained without trial in what were essentially concentration camps, where inmates endured beatings, starvation, and even castration. The colonial government portrayed the uprising as savage and irrational, using this as justification for brutal suppression. However, declassified documents have since revealed the extent of British atrocities. Historians now acknowledge that systematic abuse, sanctioned by the state, occurred. The British government's handling of the Mau Mau revolt remains a dark stain on its colonial legacy, and an example of how imperial powers often criminalized resistance movements. The British Empire's aggressive trade policies led to two devastating conflicts in China, collectively known as the Opium Wars. When Chinese authorities tried to stop the import of opium, an addictive narcotic that was destroying Chinese society, Britain retaliated with military force. The British Navy crushed Chinese resistance and imposed a series of unequal treaties that opened up ports and ceded Hong Kong to Britain. The wars marked the beginning of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. China's sovereignty was undermined, its people addicted, and its economy distorted by British drug interests. These wars epitomized the lengths to which colonial powers would go to secure economic dominance, even at the expense of entire nations. The end of British colonial rule in India was marred by one of the most violent episodes of the 20th century. When British India was partitioned into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, the subcontinent erupted in chaos. Poor planning, arbitrary borders, and a rushed withdrawal led to mass migration, communal violence, and one of the largest human displacements in history. Over 15 million people were uprooted, and an estimated 1 to 2 million were killed in communal riots, massacres, and retaliatory violence. Women were abducted, sexually abused, and mutilated, and entire villages were wiped out. Though partition is remembered as the birth of two nations, it also represents the colossal failure of colonial governance and its careless abandonment of responsibility. British colonization of Tasmania, then Van Diemen's Land, led to the near-total extermination of the island's Aboriginal population. Starting in the early 1800s, settlers seized land and violently displaced indigenous communities. Conflicts escalated into what became known as the Black War, during which Aboriginal people were hunted down and killed, often for bounties. By the 1870s, the full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal population had been wiped out. The so-called last Tasmanian, Truganini, became a tragic symbol of a vanished people. British authorities failed to intervene meaningfully and instead attempted to erase the story of genocide. Today, the Tasmanian Genocide is a stark reminder of the destructive consequences of settler colonialism. During Belgian rule of Rwanda and Burundi, colonial administrators exacerbated ethnic divisions between the Hutu and Tutsi populations. Using racist pseudoscience, Belgians classified Tutsis as racially superior and granted them preferential treatment in administration and education. This divide-and-rule policy institutionalized ethnic tensions that had previously been fluid and more socially defined. After independence, these tensions exploded into violence, culminating in the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Though the Belgians were no longer in control by then, their colonial policies planted the seeds for the massacre of nearly 1 million people in just 100 days. This illustrates how colonial legacies can have long-lasting and catastrophic consequences, even decades after independence. Colonialism was more than flags and maps. It was blood, fire, and stolen futures. These 10 moments are just the tip of the iceberg. If you believe these stories need to be remembered, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. History isn't just about the past, it shapes our present.